This is the discussion time for the next 20 minutes. So, and then we will come back at probably 7:25 or 7:30, somewhere in that range. The questions are up there. So get into groups of as many, 5, 10, whatever, and have at it. And more people will be coming in. I see them coming in now, but good luck. Have fun. Okay. Robin, did you want to make an announcement? Here's Robin.
Okay. I thank Neil for trusting me. He doesn't know what I'm going to say or what I'm going to announce.
Closer.
Yeah. But this is what I'm going to say. They always say that.
Crank her up.
Okay, thanks. Is this better? Yeah.
Yeah.
Is this better?
Yeah. Is that better? Yeah. He's teasing you.
I know. He gives me a hard time. Yeah. So, I don't know how all of you feel about the class so far, but I remember in the first 2 classes, I was just like, I am not sure what I got myself into. The table of kids in my on my table, they gave definition for faith to be to believe in something that we don't have full proof. 90% of them said that. One gal, Ailey, she quoted a verse and it was so long, I'm like, okay, I have to write it down. So I made all of them write down the definition of faith. And the verse she quoted was, faith is assurance of what we hope for and evidence of things unseen. And ever since then, I've been checking what Neil has been teaching us with that verse. And I'm like, is it kosher? Is what he's teaching us kosher? Nothing he says is from inside the Bible. But, in his book, sorry, I've been reading Mark, about the disciples. They saw Jesus walking on the water and calm the storm, come into the boat. And then the Bible says they were not sure. They didn't really believe because of what they saw with the bread. So they were still stuck with a supernatural thing before seeing Jesus walking on water. So these are disciples who have been with Jesus. And how much more are we today that cannot believe in the supernatural? And then and going through the slides in this book, I see that there's evidence. Science is pointing to evidence of things unseen, things, that point us to God. And this slide, the slides in this book has the evidence of things unseen. And now when I read the Bible and I see the supernatural things in the Bible, I'm like, wait, I know some of the evidence of the things unseen. And then so I really highly recommend the slides because, I'm a visual learner, but I was surprised when I opened the book that accompanied the slides. I was surprised I could understand what Neil was saying because that lecture, yeah, I know. I felt a little better about my IQ because that day when Neil came and delivered the message, he had come late. So instead of speaking at double speed, he was speaking at quadruple the speed, and everything just flew over my head. So I highly recommend not just the slides, the book of the slides, but also the book that is in written form that goes into the concepts here in the slides more, because it's all in question and answer format. So, the questions you would ask, it's asked in the book, and then he explains it. And it's understandable, believe me. So that time when he spoke at quadruple the speed, it's, yeah. We don't have to feel really dumb because of how fast he could speak. And I think that's why he has the books. And it's really helpful. And also, I know many of you wonder how the class was put together. And I just, I think sometimes, I don't think Neil knows all the story, and I don't think I know all the story. But I just want to thank the people. And just so you guys know, this was, this came together by the many individuals in this room. And I want to first thank the Munchies for hosting an Easter party where we reconnected. We hadn't met before, and then so I want to thank the Munchies and to show you that they are, yeah. And, the Munchies are, yeah, they went, yeah. Yeah, Karen had gone and hunted churches way in the beginning. And then I also want to thank Jackie from the Warrior Prayer Group for teaching me how to pray for our country and for Neil. Even up until now, they're still praying for Neil and his ministry. So thank you, Jackie. Yeah. They're still, I met them after the elections and through a homeschool co-op. And I've been praying with these ladies without seeing their faces. And they're still praying once in the morning, once in the evening for our country. And most of them are from China. And I went into the prayer meeting one time and just hearing this men, older elderly men weeping, saying, I escaped China to come to America, but what am I finding myself in? So I'm from Taiwan, so I don't know what it was like to grow up in a communist country, but this group of people do, and they're teaching me how to pray for our country now. And I also want to thank the Tremules. If they did not host a Bible study, I would not have reconnected with Richard de Villiers. And this is how interesting this whole thing is. And so thank you, Celine and Bruno. Yeah, they hosted an end-day Bible study, and it's just amazing. And so talk about the invisible hand. And I think all of us are here, and we're getting to know one another. I'm getting to know so many of you, and you're all so special. And this bond, this fellowship that's growing, out of Neil's class, it's just incredible, and then, it fills my heart. And I'm just grateful that my own girls and my spiritual sister, daughter, Alexis, is here from Washington, visiting. Well, thank you so much. And again, the bathroom is out in the hallway, all the way down. You had to go through the hallway, all the way down to the door. Okay, thank you.
Okay, wow. Let me turn this off. Yeah, Robin and Karen were the two that kept bugging me. Every time I saw them, they were like, so are we going to have this class? Are we going to do this class? And then Karen and I met with a church down south, and nothing came out of that. Also, it was kind of south, and there would be too much traffic. So when Richard and when we connected with Richard, that was amazing. So he's not here. He'll be back here at 8:30. So if you see him and you recognize him, he's got a big thing on his nose because he just had a cancer thing removed from his nose. But it's a great thing about that is he can walk into any store and they think it's a mask. So he doesn't have to wear a mask. So anyway, before we start, there was a question. Remind me of your name? Solomon? Yeah, Solomon asked this question. And I thought it was worthwhile answering. The question was, can God change his mind? And so I asked Solomon, I said, Solomon, why would you change your mind? And he said, because I found out that I was wrong. The other reason why you would change your mind is if you found out some new information, right? Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, I better do this differently, right? So the two main reasons why you would change your mind are if you were wrong or you found out something new. Well, can God ever be wrong? No. Can he find out anything new? No. So technically, he cannot change his mind for the same reasons that we can change our mind. He can decide to do something different, but he always knew he was going to do it at this point in time. So the first thing people say, well, what about when the couple of examples that come to mind is when God changed his mind, right? The one example is Abraham and Lot, right? Well, but if you look at that, you can see that God never changed his mind that whole thing. Because Abraham was saying, hey, God, if there are 10 good men in Sodom, will you not destroy them? And God said, sure. Because he already knows that there aren't 10 good men. He already knows there aren't 5 good men, right? So he didn't change his mind out. But the best example of what we may think God changed his mind is during the Exodus. So all the children of Israel are leaving Israel, and there's this huge event that takes place where God tells Moses, step aside, I am going to destroy all these people. And Moses says, God, this is a bad idea, because what would the Egyptians say if you take all these people out in the desert and then destroy them all? And God says, okay, I'm not going to destroy them. But what God says in that is very important. God tells Moses, step aside, I'll destroy them out, and I will make you a great nation. Now, you've got to go back about maybe 300 years before that, when Jacob is dying. And Jacob prophesies to his sons. And he turns to each of his sons, and he says to Judah, Judah, the scepter will never leave your home, your house. Meaning the line of kings is going to come from Judah. Now imagine this. God is out there, and he has told Moses, step aside, I'm going to destroy them all and make a great nation out of you. What tribe was Moses from? Levi. God had no intention of what? Saying, oh, my prophecy is wrong? No, he prophesied all along that he was going to make the king come from the tribe of Judah. And he knew that Moses, did the fact that Moses said, oh, Lord, don't do this, surprise God? Oh, man, I didn't think Moses was going to do that. He knew exactly Moses was going to do that. So in reality, God cannot change his mind. In fact, I get into arguments with atheists. He says, well, God is a slave because he can't change his own mind. I'm like, no, that's a slave to his own nature. In fact, we're all slaves to our own nature. So that's something that, it's a great question, very valid question, and yes. So what you can do at the most is make God's plans be revealed to you in the fullness of time. And that's what we're saying. Okay, so let's, whoops, I got to jump ahead. Let's go back. So the last week we talked about how the Bible was true. And I want to emphasize that Christianity isn't a blind faith. It's what? It's a rational faith built on a solid historical and logical foundation, right? And this is something I want you guys to remember over and over again as we go through this series. So last week we talked about the manuscripts of the New Testament, when they were written, and how many are there. Now let's do a quick, we won't have time for a game today because there's a lot of material to cover. But how many manuscripts and documents do we have of the New Testament? Anybody remember? 36,000, something like that, right? And how many of those are just the Greek manuscripts? Anybody remember? About 5,000, right? So we have 5,000 documents of the Greek and 36,000 of all of them combined. And when you combine them all together, there are errors in them, right? Because these are copies of copies of copies. But when you remove all the copies, remove all the errors that are very easy to determine, we find that there are less than 400 words in the entire New Testament that are in question, and we have both variations of those words. So therefore, the New Testament is actually 99.8% accurate, but we still have 100% of the content, right? So there's no doubt of the content of the New Testament. The second thing is those 400 words, while important, are not critical verses. In other words, they don't change the meaning of the verse. It was kind of funny because my wife wasn't able to make it last week, and today she's at something else. So, because she's heard these sermons so many times, she sends the kids instead. But last Sunday we were sitting in church, and she was looking at Mark. I don't know which chapter it was. She said, there's no verse 17 in this chapter. And I said, well, did you look down at the footnote? And I said, if you'd been in my class. And she said, don't give me that. Yeah, because right in the footnote it says some manuscripts don't have this verse, basically, right? So that means what they do is they put the older stuff up in the main thing, and they leave the newer stuff down the bottom. But everything is revealed to you. There's nothing being hidden from you. And that verse actually made very little difference to that passage. Mark 20, yeah, we just talked about it. So I'm like, yeah, that's one of those. And that's one of the 400 words, right? And in fact, I think it was like 8 words in that verse. So that's 8 of the 400 words right there. Okay, so today we're going to talk about how the translations are made. How do we know the New Testament authors really believe what they wrote and weren't making it up? And the names test and how we got the Bible, right? So we're going to go through a lot of stuff today. So we got to go really fast, and I'll try not to speak at quadruple speed, but that's why we have the video. Okay, so, and then we'll talk about other inconsistencies in the gospel. So let's talk about how the translations were made. So most people think that the gospel, the translation of the Bible is this, right? Everybody has played telephone before, right? My daughter was at Cooney's house. When was it? Just yesterday, day before yesterday, Sunday. And they were playing a game called, what was it called? Telestrations, where it's like playing telephone, but with illustrations. And it messes everything up. So they think that, you start with one word, you start with bees, and you end up with fleas. And so they're wondering, well, did the Bible get translated over and over again? And so we have this common concept of translations. And I actually had somebody say, well, we have no idea what the Bible said. And they say it with this authority. Well, we have no idea what the Bible said. It's been translated so many times. There's no way we can even know what it originally said. And I'm like, my usual question. What's my usual question? Is that something that somebody told you, or did you figure that out on your own? Right? Because now you're forcing them to actually think and admit that they just heard it from someone and they've never done any research on it. And so this is what most people think. But if you realize this, why would I ever want to do this? I mean, if I have the original copies, why would I ever want to make a translation of a translation of a translation? Imagine I was translating my mother's chicken curry recipe. And my mother lived 3 doors down. Wouldn't I just go ask her? Right? Let's say I had a translation. And I'm like, Mom, this doesn't look like a chicken curry recipe. It looked like my uncle's chicken curry recipe. Now, what would I do? I'd go ask her. So in the same way, if I'm doing a translation, so the truth of translation is, here's the original Greek. We don't have it anymore, right? It's been lost. But we have those earliest found Greek copies. So the earlier Bibles were made, the Old English translation was made from those copies, right? Now, if I want a newer English translation, would I go back to this translation to make my translation? Why would I? It would make no sense for me to do that, especially when all those other copies are around. So instead, what I do is I go back to those original copies and I make my new translation. It makes no sense not to do that. In fact, let's say after a while we find an older copy, a manuscript that was earlier, like the Rylands fragment, right? Now, when I make a new translation, what am I going to do? I'm going to take from all of those. So today's translations are actually more accurate than the older translations. But remember, they're only more accurate on those 400 words. Right? They're not more accurate in the thing. Now, of course, there are translations today that are completely inaccurate. So you've got to look at the intent of the person doing the translation. Right? For instance, if you ever run into something called the New World Translation, don't use that Bible. It's a Jehovah's Witness Bible. Right? And it says that Jesus is just a God with a small g, small God. They think he's Michael the Archangel, right? So you have to be very careful about the translation you get, but when you do get a translation, you can always go back to the original. And here's the beauty of it. If you don't like the translations today, go back and, that's right. So today's English translations are made from the earliest manuscripts using the rest as reference. And if you don't like or trust any of the translations, learn Greek. And then make your own translation from the manuscripts. Right? Nobody's stopping you from it. Those are all available today. Now, maybe 100 years ago they weren't, because you had to be a monk to go into the Vatican to get them. But now you can just see all the pictures. Or use a Greek-English interlinear translation. And this is the word you want to learn, Greek-English interlinear. These are great translations. And what it is, it shows you the Greek words followed by the English below it. Now, you have to be very careful. You can't see this, but when you read it, remember, Greek does not have the same grammar as English. So you will, if you do a literal translation, you will sound like Yoda. Because here's what it sounds like. Was yet human out of the Pharisees Nicodemus, named to him chief of the Jews? When 300 years old you are, look as good you will not. What that really meant was, there was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. So yeah, I mean, If you want to go around sounding like Yoda, you can do a direct translation, but otherwise, you probably want to rephrase it. Now, what about the different translations? There are lots of different translations out there. Some of the most accurate translations, they say, are the New King James, the King James. The King James, though, isn't older. It was based, the original manuscripts were older than what we have. So the newer translations of the Bible are actually have a bit more of those words in the right place. Did I just lose power? Maybe I'm out of batteries. Testing 1, 2, 3. It's just double A's. Did we lose power or something? 1, 2, 3. That's on. Is it triggering? 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, so that's not. It's not that. It's something back there. Yeah. Okay, there we go. Something bumped. Okay. So, whoa, loud. What was I going to say? I forgot what I was going to say. Oh yeah, the King James, the New King James. So they've got multiple levels. So the NIV is the New American Standard Bible is it's like a paragraph. It's a line by line translation. The NIV is, and I may have got the NASB and the NIV back, is more of a concept by concept translation in the paragraph. And then when you go to the, like the Living Bible, it's just a paraphrase of it. So you've got these different levels of Bibles translations, and you have to go and look and see how they translated the Bible. So the good thing about like the NASB is it's probably the most accurate translation, but it's a lot harder to read than the NIV. So what I'd like to do is if I'm reading through the Bible, one year I'll read through the NASB, then the next year I'll go to the NIV, and then I'll go to the New King James, right? And then I never touch the Living Bible. Because that's what I did I read the Living Bible when I was a kid. It's a nice Bible, it's a good Bible, but it's definitely not. You don't want to do a Bible study with the Living Bible, because it kind of, it's a paraphrase. It's somebody's idea of what the Bible should say. Okay. So now let's talk about, the question is, how do we know that the disciples weren't, how do we know the New Testament authors really believe what they wrote and weren't making it all up? Well, one of the reasons we know is that because all except John, I got to fix that. All except John died terrible, painful deaths after suffering and persecution. And John died in exile after suffering and persecution. Okay? Now, so you may die for a lie that somebody else made up and fooled you about, but would you suffer and die for a lie that you'd made up yourself? I mean, think about it. Hey guys, I have this great idea. We're just going to lie about Jesus and then they'll persecute us and kill us. How many are up for this? Like Peter's like, are you crazy, man? Yeah, really? So it's not really going to happen. You may die for a lot of people died for what Hitler said. A lot of people died for what for Osama bin Laden said, right? But how many people would die for a lie that did Osama bin Laden go die for his own lie? No, we had to hunt him down and kill him, right? He didn't come and sacrifice himself, right? So, the second thing is, the second question you ask is, imagine I was writing a story about the Bible, and I wanted to be a leader in this movement, right? What would I say about myself? I would say I was a great guy, right? And I would show up as the hero of the story. So one of the reasons why we know the Bible is telling the truth is because it has embarrassing testimony, right? For instance, the disciples are cowards. Peter denies Christ 3 times. The disciples run away. The women are the brave ones. Imagine that another leader was making a story about the New Testament, and we were sitting there, and we would write everything about how great we were, right? How brave we were, how wonderful we were, how accurate we were, how we were never rebuked by Jesus, and Jesus, when he died, said, you need to take over, and you're always a good guy, right? I would never have it where I denied Jesus 3 times. Good grief. If anyone should not be leader of the church, it would be Peter, right? Would I make up that I ran away when Jesus needed me? No, I would never do that. So, and imagine it comes to the story of the empty tomb, right? We've got the empty tomb there. Who finds the empty tomb? The women, right? Now, you know the women's testimony would not even stand up in a court of law. If I was writing a story that I had to convince a bunch of Jews that Jesus is risen from the dead, I would not use women as the people who found him. In fact, that would be the last thing. And then, guess what the women did? The women show up at the tomb, right? And they find Jesus. Oh, let me go this, right? They're uncaring. Actually, let me go back. Let me finish this one. So they find Jesus' grave to be empty. Now, this is how I would have written it. So there, that morning, the women were trembling and hiding in fear. And I, Peter, and John decided we knew that Jesus said he was going to rise from the dead. So both of us went out to prove that he was really risen from the dead. We went up to the tomb, and we chased those rotten guards away from the tomb. We rolled the stone away, and there the tomb was empty. We went back, and we told the women, and they were comforted. Instead, what happens? The women find the empty tomb. They run, find the hiding, cowardly disciples, and say, by the way, the tomb is empty. And then they run and find out that it really is empty. After they made sure there were no guards around, right? So the women are the brave ones. Okay, and then they're uncaring. They fall asleep on Jesus twice. They make no effort to give Jesus a proper burial. A Pharisee has to bury Jesus. They're rebuked. Peter is called Satan by Jesus. I want you to imagine this story. They're sitting around. Mark's writing the Gospels. He goes, okay, how about this? Then Peter walks up to Jesus, and Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." And Peter goes, "Why should he call me Satan? Have him call John Satan. I'm not going to be, I'm not going to even." So, I mean, can you imagine this conversation? Why would you put such damning evidence that would actually preclude you from leadership if you really wanted to be the leader of this made-up religion? Okay, there's more. Jesus is considered, if you were writing something about Jesus and you wanted him to be the hero story, you would make sure there was nothing bad about him. But instead, guess what? He's considered out of his mind by his own family. He's deserted by his own followers. He's not believed by his own brothers. His own brother doesn't believe him. I mean, what would it take for you to convince that your brother was God? Yeah, he's thought to be a deceiver. He turns out the Jewish believers to the point that they want to stone him. He's called a madman. He's called a drunkard. He's called demon-possessed, has his feet wiped with the hair of a prostitute, and he's crucified despite the fact that anyone who's hung on a tree is under God's curse. You would never put any of this unless it was true, and you were forced and you were committed to telling the truth. Now, couldn't the stories about Jesus be a myth that was invented over a period of time? Well, it turns out that tests show that even 2 generations, that's 40 to 80 years, is too short to allow legendary tendencies to wipe out the hardcore of historical facts. William Lane Craig says that. William Lane Craig, by the way, is a great debater. If you ever want to feel sorry for an atheist, I don't know if I mentioned this before, you watch a debate with William Lane Craig, an atheist, and you will actually feel sorry for the atheist. You do, but he's such a nice guy. He just dismantles the whole argument and blows it apart. So it's kind of a fun thing. I always thought, like, how do Christians debate atheists? And then I watched William Lane Craig, and it was just like, I want to be like that guy. So, couldn't the stories about Jesus be a myth that was invented over a period of time? Well, the New Testament is not mythic in its presentation. And this is something said by C.S. Lewis. Now, C.S. Lewis wrote what? The books of Narnia, the Chronicles of Narnia, which is a mythic type of thing. So he's an expert in this, right? He's an expert in ancient mythology and in writing mythical stories. Okay, what else do we know about the Bible? Well, it has eyewitness testimony. See, C.S. Lewis says the Bible is not mythical. Let's see what he means by that. Let's look at Luke, right? Luke says this. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod Tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip Tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias Tetrarch of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Ananias and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, son of Zechariah, in the desert. Now, first of all, this is very dangerous for anyone to try and say these things. Why? Because all these people were real people. And if you go find out when they lived, right? Does it sound like he's making a story? You can actually figure out the exact date. That was AD 29. All these people were in those positions of power in that year, and only in that year. Second, All people are known from history, all were known to live at this exact time, and this is not a once upon a story or myth. So, let's keep going with eyewitness testimony. The Bible is full of eyewitness testimony. Acts has 84 historically confirmed eyewitness details. John has 59 historically confirmed or historically likely eyewitness details. And Luke has many, many more. Let's go to the next one. Let's look at Acts. A few of the confirmations from Acts. Hermer, who's a historian, says there are 84 specific facts confirmed by historical and archaeological research. Acts was written by Luke. Luke was such an excellent historian that he's pretty much unmatched today. For instance, he got the ports, boundaries, landmarks, slang term, even the slang terminology he got right, local languages, local deities, local industries. He even had proper titles for numerous regional and local officials. In other words, some officials may have the same role, but they were called different things depending on the culture and the language, right? So for instance, Cyprus has a proconsul, Philippi has a governor, Thessalonica has rulers, Ephesus has town clerks, Malta has a chief man, right? So he gets these accurate every single time. And history has proven to that. And you couldn't have done that unless you were actually there or interviewed people or were very devoted to history. Because remember, they didn't have the documentation we have today. So you couldn't go back 100 years. You couldn't go back 50 years. You'd have to, maybe you could go back 20 years and figure out what was going on. Okay, there are 31 historical persons in the New Testament. Right? I'm not going to go through all of them, but these people are actually real people who existed, and we can target them and find them in history today. Now, for a while, people kept saying that the Bible wasn't true. For instance, they said Pontius Pilate never existed. They said, there was nobody called Pontius Pilate, and if anything, he didn't have that name, prefect of Judea. And then, of course, they found a stone carved with his name on it. And so they had to back down on that claim. And then they said, well, there was nobody called Caiaphas the high priest. And then they found a ossuary, which is a bone box, with his name carved on it. And it showed it was him because it was a very well-ornated carved, all this stuff is very expensive, and you only get that if you come from a rich family. So they were able to pin it right to Caiaphas. Okay, here's a very interesting thing. Let's say I'd never read the Bible. And we didn't have the Bible. But I had 10 historical, ancient, non-Christian sources, right? Historians like Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius, Thales, Phlegon, government officials, Pliny, Emperor Trajan, Emperor Hadrian, and other sources including the Jewish Talmuds and Greek writer Lucian, right? Now, if I took all that they said, now notice, I'm going to assemble something from these writers, and I'm not going to use the Bible in any of these references. Just from these historians, this is what I get. Jesus lived during the time of Tiberius Caesar. Tacitus tells us that. He lived a virtuous life. Josephus tells us that. He was a wonder worker. Josephus tells us that too. He had a brother named James. Josephus tells us that. He was acclaimed to be the Messiah. Josephus says that. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Tacitus tells us that. Actually, Josephus and Tacitus. An eclipse and earthquake occurred when he died. I think that was Lucian or some Lucian said that. He was crucified on the eve of Passover. His disciples believed he rose from the dead, and that, in fact, a whole bunch of people said that. His disciples were willing to die for their beliefs. Christianity spread rapidly as far as Rome, and his disciples denied their own gods and worshiped Jesus as God. Not one of those facts came from the Bible. They all came from history. And yet this is exactly what the Bible tells us, what the New Testament tells us. So over and over again, we see a confirmation of history through the New Testament. Now, somebody came up to me and says, well, Neil, that was 2,000 years ago. How can you trust anything that was written 2,000 years ago? How can we be sure what happened 2,000 years ago? So I racked my brain. I came up with an example. I said, okay, let me ask you this. So Einstein discovered the theory of relativity, right? If someone who knew Einstein wrote about this 25 years after it happened, would it be true when they wrote it? Yes. Okay. If you read that fact 100 years later, would it still be true? If you read that fact 1,000 years later, 2,000 years later, would it still be true? So what makes it true is not when you read it, but how long from the writing, from the event to the documentation of the event that happens, right? So wise when you read it or how old it is relevant, it isn't, right? The only important thing would be how long after the event did they write the historical account, and if they could have known it firsthand, not when somebody read it. Turns out that 2,000 years, a lot of people ask me, why did Jesus come 2,000 years ago? Because that was the most effective time to come. Because of all the evidence. In fact, as we go through, I'll mention some of these, but it turns out that the Middle East 2,000 years ago was the exact right time for Jesus to come. Okay, let's keep going. By the way, New Testament's written 25 to 6 years of it happening. Okay, could the disciples have been lying at first? And I get this a lot of times. Well, they were lying, and then it took on a life of its own, and then they were like, oh, well, I guess we're just going to go with this, right? And then they got killed for it, right? Well, here's the problem. Does evidence support this? None of them recanted, right? None of them said, this is not working for me, right? They all would have had to have a mass detailed hallucination. They would have to have write the Bible such that none of them were painted in a good light. They'd have to give up sex, money, power, sleep, safety, and family to spend their lives walking around the world, no cars, and more importantly, no air conditioning, right? And they would be running from adversaries all the time. So they had nothing to gain and everything to lose, including their lives. At some point, they would have said, this is not working. I think I'll go back to fishing. But not one of them did that. They were convinced that it was true. In the next class, we'll say, well, okay, because maybe they were fooled by Jesus. Maybe Jesus was some magic, like David Copperfield, could pretend he died and pretend he rose from the dead. So we'll have to look at that. We'll look at that next time that we meet, which is in January. But they were convinced he was telling the truth. They were completely convinced that he was telling the truth. Was he telling the truth? Remember the question in the discussion question? What does that tell you about the truth? It still may be a lie. But it tells you that the people who died for it really were convinced that they experienced those things physically, right? And we'll talk about that. Okay. Couldn't they have twisted things in their minds after 20 to 60 years? Somebody said, well, maybe at first they were like, oh, yeah, Jesus died. And then after a while, it's like, man, we really wish he had lived. And then after a while, it's like, yeah, maybe he really did live. We just were confused. Or maybe he rose again spiritually, not physically, right? And then it takes a life of his own. And then later on, it's like, yeah, he rose physically, not spiritually only, right? So then that's what he was asking me. I said, well, okay, let me ask you this. They were not arguing about some minor doctrine. If somebody you loved and spent every working hour with you for 3 years died and you physically prepared his body and buried him, would you forget that? No. If that person then physically came back to life and spent 40 days with you eating and drinking, would you forget that? If you found that you could then heal people and bring the dead back to life yourself, would you forget that? No. This was not some minor thing that happened in some long past. This was like day to day they were healing people. People were coming back to life. They were feeding people. They were taking care of the poor. And they were being persecuted for all along. And they spent 40 days with Jesus. It's kind of hard to forget. Okay. Let's, I have a question. Is anybody here named Sabbataios? No? It's a very popular name. I'm very surprised that nobody's called Sabbataios here. Okay, so we're going to talk about the names test. As you know, I was born in Ghana, and I grew up in Jamaica, Ethiopia, and Sudan, and I have a very long name. My kids joke about it all the time. They finally, I think Charlotte finally figured. Do you know how to spell it yet?
It spells like it sounds, right?
So our name in India is, at least in our part of India, is actually part of our address. So the first part of our name is actually an address. It's Marathil Parampal, which is the land of the Buddhists, or the land of some monk or something, right? And my great-grandfather bought it from this monk, and so from then on, we were called the Marathil Parampals, right? Well, that's a long name, and Mary Catherine has the longest name in our family because she has 14 letters in her regular name, so plus 16 in her family name, so it's something like, so anyway, all to say that, by the way, don't name your son's Marathil Parampal because nobody in America could spell it, so my dad would keep getting emails to Mad Mommin. Because MAD, right? They would just shorten it. Anyway, so not emails, the letters. Okay, so here's a guy that has a longer name than me.
Good. So, where are you from?
Where are you from?
Yes.
I'm from Edo State.
Edo State. Okay, interesting. So, what is your name?
My name?
Yes, your name.
My name na Ovuvwe Enyetwenwe Ugbemugwem Osas.
Pardon? Come again.
Ovuvwe Enyetwenwe Ugbemugwem Osas.
I mean, what is your name? Your name.
Your name. I really want your name.
Now my name I call for you now.
Call it again.
Ovuvwe Enyetwenwe Ugbemugwem Osas.
He became famous on the internet, by the way. He was all over the place. And then the guy came back and he said, you know, my dad has a longer name. So they went and go visit his dad, who has an even longer name. So why do I bring that up? Is because names are a very useful dating tool. Like, for some reason, none of you are named Sabbatias. Sabbatias is a very popular name. Well, we'll find out where. Okay, so let's look at these names. I don't know if you can read it, but the more names in 1900 were John was 1, William was 2, Joseph was 7, right? Girl's name, Elizabeth, was 6. Now, if you go ahead 10 years, you'll see that William, they've all changed places a little, right? Elizabeth is 7, William is 3, John is 6. Joseph is 6. When you go to 2000, all of a sudden Joseph and William are down at the bottom. Elizabeth is kind of not falling out of style, still the 10th most common name, but it's falling down. So you can see that depending on the decade and the year, your name changes. So name changes randomly in popularity, and there's nothing you can do to control it. So why is this important? So somebody had an idea. They said, I wonder if we can find out what the popularity of names were during the Old Testament time. And so they did a study of first century Jewish personal names, right? Based on a study of 3,000 names from records and archaeological finds, tombstones, ossuaries, reports, right? Now, you couldn't do this 100 years ago. You couldn't do this 2,000 years ago. You could do it maybe 20 years after the events, but you couldn't do it 100 years after the events because those records were just simply not available to you. Okay, so Jewish names in Judea turned out to be different from Jewish names in Rome or Greece or Egypt or elsewhere. For instance, Jewish male names in Egypt, Sabbatias was the second most common name. But nobody here is called Sabbatias, even though it was the second most. But wait, notice it was the second most common name in Egypt. It didn't even show up. It showed up as 68th in Judea. So less than 400 or 500 miles away from Egypt to Judea, all of a sudden that name, Sabbatias, is not even prominent there. Instead, you have a different set of names that are prominent, right? And the equal sign was tied with another one. Right? So they said, I wonder if we can match this to what we have in the New Testament. So they found out in Judea, around that century, the top 2 men's names were Simon and Joseph. The top 9 men's names consisted of 41%. Now, 41% of the people in Judea had the same 9 names, right? And you could probably guess, Simon and Joseph was a very common name. Top 2 women's name was Mary and Salome, and the top 9 women's name was 50% of the women had the top 9 names. Most of them were Mary, it turns out. Now look at this. When you take the Gospel in Acts, you find that there's a correlation. In the Gospel in Acts, 18.2% of all the men's names are Simon and Joseph. And the top 9 males match very closely. Now the women, you have a smaller sample size, but it still comes in the same area of ranking. Now, why is this important? Because if you look at the Palestinian rank of male names, Simon and Simeon was the most popular in Judea, and there are 8 people in the New Testament with that name. Joseph or Joseph there is the second most popular, and there's 6 people in the New Testament with that name. And then you start going down, and you see how all of these match statistically to the actual period. Now, imagine you were writing this, and you were creating a story 100 years later, and you were in Egypt. Because remember, Jerusalem has been destroyed in 70 AD. Everybody in Jerusalem has been thrown out of there. They've all gone somewhere else. They've been taken to other parts of the world. Now, how are you going to make up a story about Jerusalem 100 years ago and get the names right? It's impossible. If you were writing this or making this up 100 years ago, you could not get the statistical property of names correct, especially since Jerusalem had been destroyed by AD 70. And now you start seeing the level of accuracy that we have in the New Testament. At some point, it starts getting overwhelming, doesn't it? Okay, let's keep going. Are there inconsistencies in the gospel? Okay. But the Gospels don't match either 100%. I was on a mailing list with I went to school in India for 2 years. It was a missionary school. And the school was sorted between what we call the missionaries and the mercenaries. Right? So the missionaries were all the kids of the missionaries. And the mercenaries were like us. Our parents worked for foreign governments. That was the only 2 years I was in India. It was an American school. I went there with a great British accent and left with this accent because I was 13. Well, years later, now what was sad about that is that most of the missionary kids hated God. The mercenary kids were all over the place. But if there was one thing consistent about the missionary kids, a majority of them were anti-God. And I think it had something to do with their parents had gone on this mission trip, stuck their kids in a boarding school. It was a boarding school, right? So maybe they were and they were kids there from first grade in boarding school. So I think that had a lot to do with it. But anyway, so years later, I'm here in the States, and they make a Yahoo group for these kids, right? And one of the guys, and I won't say his name, puts out this really, and they're always bashing the Bible here or there, right? So one of them puts out this really mean thing about how the Bible is inconsistent, nothing matches. And he talks about, how in the Gospels you've got some documentation. Some of them says there was one angel at the tomb, and the others say there were two angels at the tomb. Some of them say this happened in this sequence and this happened in that sequence, right? And they focus on this or focus on the other. And I thought, if I answer this guy, he's not going to read it, he's not going to care, it's not going to happen. So I waited for about a month. And then something tragic happened. A Southwest flight crashed in Chicago. And I wrote, this is December 2005. I said, Neil writes a very liberal email mailing list. Hi all, I was just reading the news last night about the tragic accident in Chicago. One thing occurred to me, I don't think there really was a crash. Because when I read the story from these 5 different sources, they all seem to disagree with each other. Just shows how the liberal media twists things. Thought I'd put a little inflammatory language there. So here I listed them. Okay, AP Saturday, December 10th, 2005. A Southwest Airlines Boeing 737 rests in the middle of the Central Avenue Saturday, December 3rd. In Chicago, the jetliner trying to land in heavy snow slid off the runway Thursday at Midway Airport, crashed through the boundary fence, and slid into the street, hitting one car and putting another beneath it. A child in one of the vehicles was killed. Then I said, a snowy runway caused, and then this is a UPI, different news report, right? A snowy runway caused a Southwest Airlines Boeing 737 to skid off the runway. Nobody on the plane was seriously injured, but a 6-year-old boy was killed as the plane skid on the intersection of the 55th Street and Chilton Avenue and hit a vehicle he was traveling in. Okay. Then I said, this must be false too, because it only mentions one vehicle being hit and nothing about going through any fence. And we know that there were fences from the first report. This is a lie, I said. And then I said, okay, what about this one? Southwest Airlines sits on this one after it crashed to a security wall, and then goes through and where it hit 2 cars and killed a child. I said, see this? This must also be made up because it says the plane went through a security wall, not a boundary fence like the last one said it did. If a plane went through a brick wall, it would have exploded or at least caught on fire, don't you think? And then I did this one. Oh, this is all like in a row, right? Southwest Airlines after crashing through a safety barrier trying to land. Again, notice that nobody died in this one. This story doesn't mention that someone was killed in the crash, which is kind of important, don't you think? It talks about a safety barrier, not a wall. It doesn't talk about any cars being hit. So were no cars hit? And then this one, a Southwest Airlines rests nose first at Central Avenue, skidded off the runway. Again, no mentions of any cars being hit, no mention of hitting the wall. So this is the second AP source. It's the same source, but it says it doesn't even agree with the first source. It doesn't say anything about any cars. Forget about 2 of them. It doesn't mention a fence of any sort, nor does it mention anybody dying. You'd think that it was important. And then I did a couple more, and and I just showed them. This must be false too, and I just went on and on. And I was having a lot of fun, as you can tell. So, in the end, let's see. I think I repeated one of them. Okay, yeah. So So and then I said, this is all the liberal lying media. And this is how I concluded. I said, so folks, can you help? Are we being snowed by the media? Did this event really happen? Can we trust that it really happened? Question 1, did any cars get hit? 2 reports don't mention it. The others do. Question 2, how many cars did get hit? 1 report says only 1 car, some say 2 cars. Did anyone really die? 2 reports don't mention any death at all. What did the plane crash through? Did it crash through anything? Some reports say it was crashed through a security wall, or through a boundary fence, another through a safety fence. Some don't say anything about crashing through any of the sort of walls or fences. So my conclusion is, the story's a lie, made up by the liberal media. There may be some semblance of truth to it, but on the whole it's inaccurate and should not be given any credence, probably a myth. Each of these news media are deliberately colluding to create a false story, and they can't even get their lies straight. Besides, we all know if a plane crashes into a car, it will explode in a big fireball. At least that's what they show in the movies, right? By the way, that's not true. So this whole story is unacceptable. Another example of the lies put up by the liberal media. and then I give a tally for them. So, a whole bunch of them started attacking me. Oh, you're such a... It was all over. And then finally somebody said, Neil, why don't you pull the trigger already? I said, look, the reality is if you add these all up, most probably in actual 2 cars, 2 kids, 4 kids, 3 bears, none of the accounts were false. They were all right. They just did not say only 1 car was hit. They said 1 car was hit. Yeah. And the other one said 2 cars were hit. They didn't say only 1 car was hit. If they said only 1 car was hit, then it would be okay. The Bible story says only 1. It doesn't say only 1 angel was there. It does say 2. So maybe there was 1 angel. The person who reported it only saw 1 angel. The second person who reported it to a different source saw 2 angels. Right? None of them contradict each other. And that's what we see when we see real-world reports in our media today. We see that. And so when we see it in the Bible, we should not say the Bible is automatically wrong. We should say, let's go through and see if it makes sense. And none of the inconsistencies actually contradict each other that I've seen. And there are people who've gone through and tried to align it and say this is the actual sequence of the other. Yeah, and I think that's good. I enjoy those things. But you can't say it was wrong. And so I kind of then said, yes, this is what's happening, and this is what's going on. And the guy that was making fun of it, I reached out to him, and we actually became friends after a while, right? So it's interesting when you start looking at things with an intellectual view, and you realize these things actually do make sense. It was kind of fun, of course. I enjoyed myself tremendously. Okay, the whole point is Christianity is a blind faith, a rational faith built on a solid historical and logical foundation. So let's look at the last one. How we got the Bible, how do we know who actually wrote it? Okay, so who decided what went in the Bible? I remember reading sometime in Time magazine or some similar magazine that, and it started with, it's well known that none of the Gospels were written by the people whose names are in the Gospels. But this is sheer nonsense. True, when the Gospels were distributed, it did not say the Gospel of John or the Gospel of Matthew. This was not common in those days. Right? One would not write about that and then say this is the gospel. But remember, too, there was no Bible in the beginning. And this is a good thing. In the beginning, the only way someone skeptical could accept anything from Jesus, the dead Messiah, would if they personally knew the person who witnessed it. So in other words, the early witnesses were not, somebody told me about this. The early witnesses was, I saw this. And I witnessed this. So the first witnesses are all that first level witnesses. This is what the Bible calls seen faith. The Bible has only 2 kinds of faith, seen and unseen faith. Seen faith is where you actually see the faith. Unseen faith was the faith that somebody discussed or convinced you of. That was the unseen faith. Because the blind faith was punished by God. Remember in the Old Testament? He punishes blind faith. So the only 2 faiths that were allowed were seen faith and unseen faith. And the unseen faith was what you call argued faith or the apologetic faith, the faith of witnesses, right? And so those are the 2 types of faith that we see in the Jews. So I want to show you 2 quick charts. A lot of people think, what happened 2,000 years was in this blind darkness of history. We don't know anything about it. But that's nonsense. We not only know so much about it, we know all the names, and in most cases, we know when they were born and when they died. For instance, Peter had a disciple called Linus. Linus had a disciple called Anacletus. Anacletus had a disciple called Clement. So we have this succession of apostles, right? And if you start looking at that, you see that if you start looking at the overlap of the apostolic fathers, this is Peter, James, John, all the apostles, and Paul, and you start seeing that they overlapped with Ignatius of Antioch. Ignatius of Antioch and Clement of Rome, right? So these guys all had an overlapping, what we call the Greek fathers, right? These were the Greek apostles. And they overlapped with all these guys. And you can see the overlapping goes on quite a ways. In fact, if you actually look at the what we call the chain of custody. So Clement knew who wrote the Gospels. Ignatius knew who wrote the Gospels. In fact, they pass it on to these other people. Like Justin Martyr was a disciple learned from Polycarp, and you see this what we call a chain of custody, an apostolic succession. And I decided to sit down one day, and I wanted to see what the overlaps were. And so we have Jesus there. He was born in 4 BC, and he was converted in -4 BC, and he died in 33 AD, right? Well, John the Apostle, we think his birth was around 10 AD. He was converted around 27, and he died when he was about 100, and he writes the Gospel of John, right? Well, Polycarp was born in 69 AD, right? So he overlapped John, and he was a student of John, a disciple of John, and we don't know exactly when he became a Christian, but we do know when he died. He knows John personally. Irenaeus, right? So you start going through all these, and then you have the Great Persecution. That's when the emperor came and started killing a lot of people. But even through the Great Persecution, we have Gregory, who survives the persecution, and Eusebius, who starts the history project around 296, and he starts documenting what we consider the Bible is today, and who the apostles is. Then Anastasius, and then we have Augustine, who is the one who actually gets together to put the Bible together. And if you'll notice this, and that's the Council of Hippo. And if you start looking at this, you have how many generations do you have between when the Bible was put together and when it was written, and there are only 6 people in between. 6 generations between when the Bible was written and when it was assembled. Okay? Okay, how do they choose what was in the Bible? How do we know the Gospels are really... Oh, let me go over this. How do you know it's really written by those authors? Well, quite simple. For the New Testament, the process of recognition and collection began in the first century of the Christian church. Very early on, some of the New Testament books were being recognized. Paul considered Luke's writings to be authoritative as the Old Testament, because he says so in his writings, right? So the New Testament tells about the other New Testament gospel. Peter recognizes Paul's writing as scripture. The New Testament itself mentions how some of the books in the New Testament were being circulated by the churches. So within the New Testament, there's consistency. But was Peter written by Peter? Well, Clement of Rome mentioned at least 8 New Testament books. One of them was Peter's. Ignatius of Antioch acknowledged 7 books. Polycarp, disciple of John, acknowledged 14 books. Irenaeus mentioned 21. Hippolytus recognizes 22 books. So the books that had the most controversy, we're not sure if this really should be in the Bible, were Hebrews, James, 2 Peter, 2 John, and 3 John. Okay? Those are the ones that received the most controversy, but then there was enough of apostolic succession that they said, yes, these were part of the Bible. So, the first canon was the Muratorian canon, not to be confused with something in Star Trek, which was compiled in AD 170. The Muratorian canon included all the New Testament books except Hebrews, James 1, 2 Peter, and 3 John. You can see why they were controversial. In AD 366, the Council of Laodicea stated that only the Old Testament, along with the book of Apocrypha and the 26 books of the New Testament, everything but Revelation, were canonical and to be read in the churches. And then the Council of Hippo and the Council of Carthage are from the same 27 books as authoritative. So that's how they decided, that's how they were put together. Now, let's see how they were decided. Here's how they decided they were canonical. Is the book authoritative? Does it claim to be of God? Is it prophetic? Was it written by a servant of God? This is very important. Do we know who wrote it? Is it authentic? Does it tell the truth about man and God? Is the book dynamic? Does it possess transforming power? Is the book received or accepted by people from whom it was originally written? Is it recognized as being from God? And this is probably the most important test. Do we have that apostolic succession of those books? Do we know where they came from? Yeah.
What about Hebrews? Because we
Yeah, we don't know who the author is, so you can argue whether Hebrew should be in there. They thought it should be, and there's nothing in Hebrews that would make you think it shouldn't be, right? Okay. How do we know Matthew wrote Matthew? We only had time for Matthew and John, but there were many of these. Papias, Irenaeus, Plantius, and Origen all report Matthew as the writer of the first gospel. Okay? These guys, some of them knew him personally. 2, Papias, born in 60 AD, wrote, Matthew put together the oracles of the Lord in the Hebrew language, and each one interpreted them as best he could. This wasn't done in darkness. It's not like we're sitting there going, I wonder who wrote the Gospel of Matthew. His own disciple said he wrote the Gospel of Matthew. Why would we then question it, right? The Didache, remember the Didache? We talked about that. Dating to 80 AD, quotes Matthew, Luke, and other parts of the New Testament, meaning those leaders knew the authors. Remember that? It dates before the earliest copy fragment of the Bible we found. The only way they knew it was Scripture was if it came from the original apostles or the appointed Paul. How about John? John, we know the author was a Jew. We know he was an eyewitness of many of the events. He knows things that he had to be there for, like the loaves and the fish event. Ignatius, born in 35 AD, says this gospel was from John. The Council of Laodicea, Hippo and Carthage all say it was written by John. Today we have an ancient preface to this gospel. There's a referral to a work by Papias, a disciple of John in AD 125. The preface notes that Papias claims the gospel was written by John. So Papias thinks it was written by John. And then, of course, Polycarp, who was an apostle of John, says, but Polycarp, no, not Polycarp, he was Irenaeus was an apostle of Polycarp, and Polycarp was an apostle of John, because you can see he overlaps, and then he overlaps with Irenaeus. Also was not only instructed by the apostles and conversed with many who had seen Christ, but was also by apostles themselves in Asia, appointed bishop of the church in Smyrna, whom I also saw in my early youth, for he tarried on earth very long. So Polycarp basically said, I knew John, right? And when a very old man, gloriously and most nobly suffering martyrdom, departed this life, having always taught the things which he had learned directly from the apostles and which the church had handed down. Handed down, which alone are true. If you want to find out more, there's a great book called The Canon of Scripture by F.F. Bruce. I would recommend that. It's a great companion to any of his studies. So let's wrap this up. Reasons we don't need to doubt the Bible. 1, copies date to within 25 years. Okay? 2, copies spread around the world over the centuries. They match within 99.8% of each other. 3, the 0.2 differences are minor and not theological issues or resurrection contradictions. We have 100% of the possibilities. 4, 31,000 copies of the manuscripts are available today. 5, by the way, you'll have all these slides on the thing by day after tomorrow. 5, we can recreate over 40% of the Bible from the quotes alone, and they match the New Testament. It's translated into many other languages as well, which can also be used to verify the original words. The names match statistically, which would be impossible to fake without modern archaeology. The authors include embarrassing testimony. The authors died for what they wrote. It's historically verified content. And the chain of custody, we have a apostolic succession. I want to wrap this up with, I want you to contrast that with anything you have for Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, or any of the other religions. You compare the weight of the documents. But it's not just the Bible that's provable. Jesus is provable, and we'll do that in the next session when we meet, which will be January 10th, I think, or something like that. I'll tell you. So here are the 6 steps that we're going to cover. 1, prove the Bible, faith should never be blind. We did that. 2, prove that God exists without using science. 3, prove the New Testament is accurate, which we just did. 4, we're going to prove that Jesus really existed and rose from the dead. We actually kind of proved he already existed in this session, right, with all the other historians. And number 5, explain why Christ had to die and why God must punish sin. So the next session is we're going to prove that Jesus really existed and actually physically rose from the dead. And number 6, explain how evil and God can coexist. So I want to wrap this up with something very, very important. When the ancient Greeks and Romans had to make decisions, they would consult the gods. They would draw lots, they would cast dice, they would interpret dreams, and they would analyze things like sneezes, yes, sneezes, thunderbolts, and the gizzards of dead birds. And they'd cut over a bird and they'd look at its gizzards and say, this is what the future foretells. But for the matters of utmost importance, they sought to hear the words of God from the oracles. The most influential voice was the Delphic Oracle, belonging to a woman. The auricular temple was perched on the south slope of Mount Parnassus, surrounded by high cliffs about 75 miles west of Athens. If you studied Greek history, you probably studied this. Getting to Delphi required either a long trek across the mountains or sea voyage across the north shore of the Gulf of Corinth. However difficult the journey, thousands of visitors sought guidance from the holy woman called Pythia, who spoke on the behalf of the gods. And they would travel for days, and they would wait days. And the priests and the temple attendants at this Mount Parnassus would stand there, and they would determine the order of the queue. If you were important, if you were a state ambassador from another state, then you were given advanced standing in the queue every day. And then they would work their way down to military commanders, athletes, poets, and last of all, heads of families concerned about a child or an investment. The supplicants would pass bronze statues, war monuments, treasure houses dedicated to the Delphi, the oracle, by these grateful visitors. And it would have been late in the day before you, as an ordinary schmuck, would have been allowed to talk to the Delphi oracle. And you would have reached the terrace of the temple, and you would have seen those great inscriptions that say, "Know thyself and nothing in excess." And then finally they would get their chance to ask the question. The question would be, what do the gods say about my child? Will my child live? Will my business succeed? Should I make this investment? Should I make this treaty? Questions that they traveled days, sacrificed time and money, and waited. And then there are questions, and they'd bring it to the oracle of Delphi. She was this strange waif of a woman. She would take their questions and she would sit over this steep chasm of which noxious fumes would come out of this volcanic vapor. Strange volcanic vapors would arise out of this crevice from a volcano and put her in altered states. It's probably poisoning her. And then she'd deliver her answer to the priest, who would come back and give you the answer, and half the time you had no idea what it meant. It was cryptic. And yet, they would travel miles and days just to hear an answer from God. And yet here we stand with a Bible in our iPads, in our phones, on our desks, and we're not reading it. The actual proven word of God is in our hand. We don't need to travel miles. We have it right there. Everything is right there. All the wisdom of the universe that is sufficient for us. We know the words. It's historical active. People have died for this. This is an actual Bible of a man in India who was beaten half to death because he was a Christian. People change with those words. Kingdoms change with the words. The world changed with those words. So let me ask you this. If this is God's letter to you, what sort of powerful impact should this be on your life? As we saw in ancient times, people sought out mediums and prophets to hear from God, and yet we can hear from God anytime, all the time. If you're not reading the Bible, let me recommend that you read it on a regular basis. I like the Bible in 1 year. Let you go through it. You can pick different translations. They have a summary. I don't always read what their analysis are, but you can do it 10 minutes every day, and you'll go through the Bible in a year. Thank you. Our next class is January 11th, proving Jesus actually existed. He actually rose from the dead in a case that will stand up in a court of law. Any questions? Thank you. Let's do some questions. Before I do questions, real quickly, we've got the petition for school choice. If you go to a private school or homeschool, you can get $14,000 if this passes. It'll be an uphill battle, but we got to get 1.5 signatures first, get on the ballot, and then we have to get 50%. And you know the school unions are going to fight to them. Yeah, each county has to have its own. So if you live in Santa Clara County, make sure everybody on that page is Santa Clara County. Yeah, but it's all California statewide. Yes. Questions right there.
Yeah, for the translations, for like punctuation, that wasn't in the original. How
Yes,
did they decide
know
that?
the verses.
For example, like when Jesus said to the person on the cross, the thief on the cross, truly I say to you, comma, today you'll be with me in paradise, as opposed to, if they decided, maybe he said, truly I say to you, today, comma,
You
you'll
will
be
be
with
in
me in
paradise.
paradise.
Yes, yeah. So there is a good, so that is, and those are the arguments that Christians have all the time, is where's the punctuation? Now, a good, some of those are easily, not easily, are reconciled if you're a Greek scholar and you know how the sentence structure should be. Others are difficult to read, and I agree with that, yeah. But again, it would differ as to whether he was today in paradise or someday in paradise. Yes, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, so the original Greek had no commas. I think does Latin have commas?
I don't think they.
Pardon? Yeah, so Latin is like Greek in that it has no punctuation, right? But there are such sentence structures and things like that. But yeah, so there is a difficulty. There were no verses in the Bible, right? John didn't go, verse 1. He just wrote. And then Martin Luther and a bunch of other people kind of broke it up and made it easier to read. So, next question.
Hand high, please. Okay. There.
You're going to make her work.
Does like the idea of omnipotence contradict the notion of free will? Like if someone knows everything, won't they know what I'm going to do tomorrow?
Great question. So there are two things you have to understand. Is foreknowledge is not predestination. Let me give you a great example. This was actually an example a friend of mine named Kent Osby gave me maybe 30 years ago in a Bible study. He said, let's say you and we were in that Bible study. The guys were still great friends. Simon was in the Bible study with me. And he said, okay, let's say you and Simon go to the horse races. And you bet money on it, which I would never do, but for the example. And you bet on Neil's nightmare, and Simon bet on Simon's surprise. So he said, hey, look, our names are there. We're going to bet on these horses. Well, Neil's nightmare turns out to be a nightmare. The horse trips, the jockey falls and breaks his leg, and Simon's surprise takes off and wins. And Simon comes back with $10,000. I lost my $100. And I go, man, I wish I could do that race again. Suddenly, a guy in a DeLorean drives up. He's got gray hair and says, and we go like, Doc! He goes, hey, yeah. If you haven't seen Back to the Future, you'll know what I'm talking about. And he opens his DeLorean and he says, come into my time machine. We're going to go back 15 minutes before the race. We go back 15 minutes before the race. Guess what I know about Neil's nightmare? He's going to trip and break the jockey's leg. And Simon's surprise is going to win. I have foreknowledge about exactly what's going to happen, but have I predestined it? Neil's nightmare still has the free will to win that race. I just know he's not going to be able to do it. So he has free will, but my foreknowledge does not preempt his free will. So this is the question that you're asking. Does God's foreknowledge preempt our free will? Not necessarily. Could it? Yes, she could, because he could come in. I could say, well, Neil's nightmare is going to trip. I'm just going to trip him on purpose. He's going to trip anyway, so I'm just going to trip, make sure it happens. So I could affect the race, but if I didn't, it still wouldn't. So that's a great question, and I think we have to understand the difference between foreknowledge and predestination. So it's a very valid question. So omnipotence means that God knows everything, but he knows all contingencies, but nothing contingently. Famous saying by R.C. Sproul. He knows all contingencies. That means he knows anything that could happen, but he doesn't know anything contingently. Meaning he knows what is going to happen. He doesn't have to wait for something else to happen for him to know. So, great question. Yeah. Yeah, don't bet on Neil's nightmare.
Yeah. All right. Next question. All right. Here.
Just a comment. Earlier, you talked about how different media account for the same event, and they have different things that happen. When the mainstream media, they want to
Yeah.
promote a fake media, they will all coordinate and
Yes.
they all say exactly the same
Yeah,
thing.
that's true. So they could, and they do. We have seen collusion in media. I don't think this was the case for it, because there was no ulterior motive, but yeah. Next question. Anyone?
All right, so this question is over a specific piece of scripture, but I was just thinking a couple days ago about how Jesus was tempted in the desert by
Oh,
the
yeah.
devil, and then it says that the devil brought him to the top of the temple and also onto the top of a high hill. And I was just wondering, if Jesus was in a body, how could he have been transported like that? And also, why, like, he had the choice to say no, so why didn't he?
So the temptations are always a puzzle. So first of all, let's talk about being transporting. So Satan, I'm actually in the middle of writing a paper called The Theological Consequences of Multidimensionality. We'll see how far that goes, right? There are a lot of theological consequences of multidimensionality. So one of the consequences is, can Satan do anything to a Christian without the Christian's permission? And the answer is no, right? And there's a logical reasoning behind that based on the Bible. But so I would say that Jesus allowed Satan to transport him. Jesus could do miracles, so that would be one of the miracles he would do in his body. Because remember, he turns water into wine and he walks across the water, right? So there are things that he could do. But I want to add this, though, and this is if you go to my website, it's called Are Miracles Possible? And I go through an analysis of all the miracles, or a certain group of miracles, and there are actually no illogical miracles. Every single miracle is actually physically possible and physically explainable using science. The question is, how did they access that technology? Arthur C. Clarke says any sufficiently advanced technology looks like magic, right? He was a science fiction author. Let me explain. You drop the walls of Jericho. We'll go and we'll talk about Jericho. This was not how it was done. But I say, look, dropping the walls of Jericho is really easy. One Sidewinder missile from an F-35 will drop the walls of Jericho. The question is, where did the Sidewinder missile come from, right? So it's not physically impossible. The question is, where did that technology come? Somebody says, oh, yeah, well, that's one answer. What about changing water into wine? What about the miracle of the 5 loaves and 2 loaves and 5 fish? And I said, well, that's easily explainable. They said, how? I said, ever watch Star Trek? And they said, I think we're trying to talk about reality. I said, no, Star Trek has this concept of the matter-energy converter. The matter-energy converter just basically turns energy into matter. It's physically possible. We just don't know how to access that technology today. But it's not impossible to change matter into energy. I can take molecules of anything and theoretically convert it into molecules of anything else by just moving the right electrons around, right? In fact, that's what we make bombs out of. So the question is not, can it be done logically, matter to energy conversion? So I'm converting matter into energy, and then energy back into matter. I turn air in the energy in the air into matter, which would be the fish, right? So the question is, how did Jesus fit it into the palm of his hand? The energy converter. Well, I don't think it was an energy converter. But my point is that if we can see, well, that is possible by science, then why isn't it possible by God, right? And that's the argument we're trying to make. So all these things, I had a big debate with an atheist once, and his argument was, well, I don't buy that. I'm like, why don't you buy it? Well, because the wine tasted really good. I'm like, so they figured out how. He goes, how would you put the aging process into the wine? I'm like, it's all down to molecules, right? But the aging process has to do with the amount of molecules that come from the wine barrels, right? And we have this big 5-minute conversation somewhere on the internet, and atheists going back and forth about the quality of the wine, right? Great question. Next. Yes, right here. I love that most of the kids are asking the questions this time.
This is a ridiculous question, but do you know that unicorns don't exist because they might have died out before we knew?
Well, no, I don't think it's a really good question, but I actually have a video on this. So I'll give you the short answer because we don't have time to find the video. So it turns out that I don't know if the real unicorn that we think of a unicorn with a horse with a horn and head, we don't have any fossil evidence for that, but maybe they did die, but there was no fossil evidence. But let me tell you what an atheist wants to. They said, well, look, the Bible talks about unicorns, and we know they didn't exist. The Bible is a story of myths. And I said, yeah, have you read the Bible? And they were like, yes, okay. And what does it say? It says unicorn. Yes. Do you know what that word means? And he's like, yeah, it means a horse with one horn. I go, no. It means an animal with one horn. And I said, have you ever looked at the definition of a rhinoceros? There are two types of rhinoceros. There's unicornus and bicornus. And when the King James was translated, it was translating the word unicornuses as rhinoceros, right? So the Old Testament is talking about the rhinoceros, the unicornus, right? It wasn't talking about the bicornus, which is the two-horned rhinoceros, right? And if you start looking back at that, you will see exactly. In fact, I just posted something on my on Facebook. By the way, you're all welcome to join my Facebook if you can handle me mocking my liberal friends. It's Neil Politics. It's Jesus Politics Neil, because I had to change my name because I was not getting hired by anybody because of my views on Facebook. But so this atheist puts out this thing that says, well, you know, the Bible called bats birds. So you can see the Bible has no idea about morphology or homology. And so the answer, the guy who responded to that said, actually the Bible does not call bats birds. It uses the word off. The word off meant fowl. To the Hebrews, fowl meant winged animal. And a fowl is a winged animal. And so the Hebrews, off would be a winged animal, and the winged animal would be birds and bats. And in many cases, it could be even insects. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to take the English translation of a word with its modern day connotation, same thing with the unicorn, right? When you really should have to go back to the original intent of the word and how did they mean to use it and what did it mean to the people at that time. So that's another part of the translation of the Bible that we have to be very careful about. Yes. We are past our time. Let's take 2 more questions and then we'll be done. Sorry we didn't have a game this time. Next time we'll have a game. We just had so much to cover. Right here.
So when was Jesus first able to do miracles? Because when he was 12, he could already talk to the priests. But when it was before he turned water to wine, he said that his time was not yet come. But then the very next moment, he turned water into wine. Doesn't make sense.
Okay, so let me repeat the question. I don't know why we're cutting out there. But so the question was, when was Jesus first able to do miracles? And when his mom asked him to turn water into wine, he said, my time had not yet come. So I think the answer to it is he was able to do miracles probably a lot earlier than we think, probably when he hit maturity, which could have been really early. If you look at some of the Gnostic gospel and some of the not apocryphal, but some of the, I want to say some of the more different Orthodox traditions, Jesus, when he was a baby, he brought a bird back to life. You know, there's a version of Jesus, the movie Jesus, that was done like in the 60s or something, and they use that tradition where they have him, where a bird dies and he brings it back to life. That's one of the more of the not mainline biblical stories. But so there's a question of when did he actually know that, and I don't know the answer to that. I know that it was probably when he was mature enough to understand that he had these powers, because we do know that he grew in wisdom too. But you have to understand the difference between Christ's human nature and his deity, right? They're both tied together, but we don't know. There are many things about that we don't. What's it called? The homostatic union that we don't understand. So there's a lot of questions, and there's a lot of theology about that. And I would hesitate to delve into that lest I teach you some heresy. But my guess is that he knew. So the only reason he didn't do it, he didn't want to do that because that wasn't his time to do it, but he could do it. He just wasn't supposed to do it, maybe. Or yeah. Last question.
My question is about the book of Genesis.
Yes.
I don't know exactly where it is, but when God tells the serpent that he will crawl on his belly for all of his life or something like that, what is the meaning of that? Because serpents already crawl on their bellies, right? So was it a special kind of serpent that didn't?
So the girl standing next to you, this was her question when she was 5 or 6. she would just bug me about, Dad, how do serpents speak? It makes no sense. Was it pretending to be a serpent? Was a serpent pretending to be a person? Was it a puppet? You had all
Lizard.
these. Huh? Was
Lizard
it a lizard?
malfunction.
Right. So there are a lot of questions there. So there are legless lizards. I know. They look like snakes, but they're lizards. And there are fossils of snakes with legs. Right? So both of these are there. So it could be either of those. But behind that question is another question. How did the serpent speak in the garden? And I should do a presentation on this because it's actually really neat when you look at the pictures. The word for serpent is actually snake in Genesis. But the snake was very closely related to the word seraphim. Now, if you know what a seraphim is, the seraphim was the kind of angel that surrounds the throne of God. In fact, if you look at and the picture I would have showed you, is the Babylonian throne room was covered in seraphim. And these are these serpentine creatures with wings, and they're really majestic creatures. Now, they're scary for us, but because we hate snakes. So the question is, was the serpent a serpent, or was he a seraphim? A serpent-like creature that looked like, a seraphim is a serpent-like creature, looks like a serpent, and is a serpent in a sense, but has different aspects. So was it a seraphim? Was it a lizard or a snake with legs? We don't know that, but there's enough there to let you know that there's a lot deeper, there's a lot more going on there than when you just see that story. That story is what is passed on, and that story is what Moses wrote down, but it's written to tell you, it's not written to give you the details, it's written to tell you what happened. So the question is, what the underlying meaning of the cross? If it was a seraphim, that would mean that he would no longer fly, that it would actually be relegated to earth, right? That is where you get the book of Enoch, which is kind of weird, but it talks about a lot of these things, these beings that were stuck on earth, and then you see these beings show up again as the daughters of, the sons of man and the daughters of God, or whatever, the other way around, right? And you have these giants in those days. So there's a lot going on there that we don't really know, we don't really understand. I would love to know. I find it very interesting, but it's not a matter of, I wouldn't build any theology on it. Yeah. But I would think it's something close to that. Mike has a comment.
I just want to recommend to everyone a real theologian, an expert in all this stuff. His name is Dr. Michael Heiser.
Heiser, yes.
And he's an expert in Semitic languages, and he talked about Genesis 6. Dr. Michael Heiser. He's interviewed by many people, but one of them is Dr. Sean McDowell. So just go to YouTube.
He was actually here 2 years ago.
Yeah, and
right?
I missed him, and I hate myself for that. He's an amazing theologian, and he's published in peer-reviewed journal and everything. He's
got a great insight, because there's a concept in the Old Testament and the New Testament. There's a concept of gods, and and this actually plays into my whole theological consequence of multidimensionality. Is there's when the Bible uses the word gods with a small g, they're really talking about angels or a council of angels and things like that. And Heiser goes into all that detail. It's kind of a very interesting.
I'll tell you where you can go. So again, go to YouTube and type Sean McDowell, who is the son of Josh McDowell. He himself has a doctorate in theology, I guess. Anyway, so he has a podcast. So Sean McDowell, Dr. Michael Heiser, Divine Counsel. And he goes through all that. You can buy his books, and he goes into great depth. Yesterday I was listening to, he was talking about Daniel, I think that. Anyway, it works. Yeah, so check it out. It's not a myth. Those are real beings, and God had other beings before us. So Heiser. Thank you.
Okay, let's pray. We're kind of late. Thank you very much. If you have more questions, feel free to come up. And we'll see you on January 11th, proving Jesus really rose from the dead. So, Gerald, thank you again for this awesome time to get together and realize what you have given to us in the Bible, Lord. I pray that everyone here leaves with an appreciation of what they have and a desire to read it, desire to dwell in it, and a desire to absorb it, Lord, and a desire to glorify you. Thank you. In Jesus' name, amen. That one's done.
Don't we just okay? So I just wanted to say to the live streamers, thank you so much for tuning in. Just know that books and links to Neil's websites are linked down below in the description. Leave a like and share, and we'll see you next time.
You can tell she has a YouTube channel.